The television was too loud, its blue-white light flickering aggressively, vibrating the lightweight veneer coffee table where Arthur had left his untouched mug of cooling coffee. Arthur listened, his breath held tight in his chest, to the frantic cadence of the emergency broadcast system, the announcer's voice cracking under the weight of the impossible confirmation, betraying the practiced calm of decades of drills. It wasn't a drill. The red banner flashing across the screen, DEFCON 1 confirmed. Seek immediate shelter was the final, undeniable proof that decades of escalating tension, proxy conflicts, trade wars, and relentless, corrosive paranoia had culminated in this terminal, unforgivable moment. Outside, the autumn air was unnaturally still, the oak leaves frozen in a perpetual, silent wait. The neighborhood children were inside, thankfully oblivious, their laughter a distant, fragile memory. Then came the sound that drowned out the television, the primal, unmistakable shriek of the air raid sirens, a sound designed to bypass reason and strike directly at the survival instinct. It was not the monthly test tone, but a sustained, desperate wail that clawed at the eardrums, the sound of millions realizing simultaneously that preparation was over. The street, moments ago placid and empty, erupted in chaos. Cars collided at the intersection, horns blaring in useless protest. Neighbors, previously reserved, shoved one another, their faces masks of pure, evolutionary terror. Arthur watched Mrs. Peterson drop her grocery bag. The shattered glass of pickled beets glinted on the asphalt, a ridiculous, mundane casualty of the inevitable firestorm. He didn't move toward the car. The roads were already clogged arteries, leading nowhere. Shelter was the only option. The nearest public shelter was miles away, likely sealed. He remembered the old basement under his house, a concrete box built for tornadoes, not thermonuclear incineration. He was halfway down the narrow wooden stairs when the world ended. There was no warning rumble, no distant explosion, just the light. It was absolute, immediate, and total illumination, a blinding white void that permeated the walls and burned directly onto the retinas, even through closed eyelids. This was the pure, unfiltered energy of fusion, a star born on the terrestrial surface. The basement door, flimsy against the sudden, crushing atmospheric pressure change, buckled inward with a sound like tearing steel. The heat arrived fractions of a second later, not warmth, but a physical assault, a wave of superheated air that stripped the paint from the walls and instantly vaporized the dust motes suspended in the atmosphere. The temperature spike was so instantaneous that the very oxygen in the room seemed to ignite, creating a brief, choking vacuum as it was consumed. The sound followed the light, a single monolithic crack that was less noise than a physical restructuring of reality. It was a pressure wave traveling at supersonic velocity. It compressed his lungs and drove the air from his body, simultaneously deafening him and making his internal organs vibrate against his ribs. It was the sound of 1 billion tons of concrete and steel being pulverized, the atmosphere ripped open, the city reduced to plasma and shrapnel. Arthur fell, his ears ringing with a tone so high it felt like his skull was vibrating apart. He instinctively curled into a fetal position under the rickety workbench, his hands clamped over his head, a gesture utterly meaningless against the power unleashed above him. He could smell the acrid metallic tang of vaporized copper and ozone, mixed with the sickeningly sweet scent of burning plastics from the floor above. The house groaned, not the familiar settling of an old structure, but the death cry of wood and nails being twisted beyond their breaking point, the foundation shifting violently as the ground absorbed the shockwave. Dust and pulverized insulation rained down, suffocating and hot. He felt the granular grit settling in his throat, dry and poisonous. The light pulsed again, dimmer this time, but still visible through the cracks in the foundation. The secondary detonation, turning the city skyline into a column of churning, radioactive smoke that climbed miles into the stratosphere, poisoning the upper atmosphere. Then the silence. Not the peace of a quiet afternoon, but a profound, terrifying void where the sounds of civilization had been. The ringing in his ears was the only constant, a high-frequency whine that masked the sounds of structural collapse. He could hear the faint, sickening drip of water or something else from a shattered pipe overhead. The air was thick, heavy, tasting of ash and metal, carrying the faint, distant scent of ozone and electrical fire, a signature of truly massive energy release. He tried to move, but his limbs were leaden, his mind struggling to process the impossible reality that the sun outside was now a synthetic, poisonous star rising from the ruins of the world. The Great War had lasted exactly 2 hours, but for those who survived the initial blast, the war had just begun. The only sound now was the soft, continuous sift of fallout settling over the remnants of the world. The high-frequency whine in Arthur's ears persisted, a screaming counterpoint to the absolute silence of the world outside. He lay shivering beneath the splintered workbench, the air cooling rapidly as the initial thermal pulse dissipated, leaving behind a heavy, humid residue of combustion and ionized gas. His lungs ached, feeling bruised from the sudden vacuum and subsequent overpressure. He risked movement, unfolding his body slowly, every muscle protesting the sudden, violent jolt. The basement floor was a slick mosaic of shattered terracotta, pulverized drywall, and something sticky and warm that he desperately hoped was oil from the furnace. He pushed himself up onto his knees, the gritty dust immediately clinging to the moisture on his skin and eyes, turning his face into a mask of gray mud. The metallic tongue of ozone was overwhelming, suggesting that the electromagnetic pulse, the silent killer preceding the blast, had done its work, rendering any surviving electronics inert slag. The only light source was the sickly orange-red glow filtering through the newly formed cracks in the foundation, a radioactive aperture looking out onto hell. The house was not merely damaged. It was structurally compromised, held together by sheer luck and the stubborn rigidity of century-old timbers. Above him, the ceiling joists groaned, their tension members snapping one by one, releasing plumes of insulation that drifted down like poisonous snow. The furnace, a massive, cast-iron beast, had been ripped from its moorings and lay canted precariously, its internal pipes weeping a thin stream of what smelled like burnt coolant. Arthur had to get out. The air quality was worsening. A deadly cocktail of particulates, fission products, vaporized building materials, and microscopic fragments of silicate glass formed by the intense heat flash. Breathing was a conscious effort, each shallow inhale scraping his throat raw. He crawled toward the basement door, the one that had buckled inward. It was now jammed, wedged tight against the concrete frame by the shifted foundation. He braced his shoulder against the warped wood, pushing, his muscles screaming in protest. The wood refused to yield. He tried again, applying his weight, feeling the sharp, searing pain of friction burns on his palms. He scanned the immediate vicinity, his vision momentarily blurring from the effort. His gaze settled on a rusted pipe wrench lying half-buried in the rubble near the remains of the washing machine. It was heavy, solid, a potential tool. He dragged himself toward it, the sound of his movement, the crunch of debris, the rasp of his own breathing amplified in the oppressive quiet. Securing the wrench, he returned to the door, using the heavy metal head as a makeshift pry bar. He jammed the jaw into the gap between the door and the frame, levering with desperate, focused strength. A sickening sound of tearing wood finally split the silence. With a final explosive heave, the door gave way, collapsing into the darkness of the ruined stairwell beyond. The ascent was a vertical climb through the wreckage. The wooden stairs were gone, reduced to kindling and splinters. Arthur used the exposed studs and the remaining sections of wall as handholds, pulling himself up through the layers of debris. He could hear the crackle now, the greedy sound of fire consuming the upper floors. The air temperature rose dramatically as he neared the main floor, the heat radiating downward, dry and suffocating. He emerged into what had been the living room. It was unrecognizable. The roof was gone, ripped away by the blast's suction phase. The walls were standing, but leaning inward, stripped bare, the wallpaper vaporized, leaving behind scorched plaster. Where the windows had been, there were now gaping holes framed by melted glass, offering a direct, horrifying view of the outside world. The sight was an absolute negation of order. The sky was gone, replaced by a churning, colossal dome of black and ochre smoke that blotted out the sun entirely. The air was thick, heavy, visibility reduced to perhaps 50 yards through the swirling soot. The familiar landmarks of his neighborhood, the towering oak trees, the neighbor's meticulously kept fence, the corner market were erased, replaced by a flat, uniform field of pulverized concrete and skeletal remains of structures. The blast had not merely destroyed, it had sterilized, grinding everything into a fine, toxic powder. The sheer scale of the obliteration defied human comprehension. It was a landscape sculpted by unimaginable physics, a final definitive statement on the failure of civilization. Arthur felt a cold, detached awe at the efficiency of the destruction, a feeling quickly replaced by a desperate, crushing loneliness. He stood in the center of the ruined room, a ground beneath his feet vibrating faintly with the continuous, distant roar of massive fires consuming the downtown core miles away. The heat emanating from that direction was intense, a palpable physical force that made the air shimmer. He realized with a sickening lurch that the surface temperature of the ground was dangerously high, a consequence of the thermal radiation soaking into the asphalt and concrete. His eyes scanned the immediate area for any sign of life, but there was only silence and destruction. The silence was the worst part, the lack of sirens, traffic, birdsong, human cries. It was the silence of extinction. He saw the shadow of a human being etched into the remaining brickwork of the house across the street, a ghostly, white outline where a person had stood, shielding a brief moment from the thermal flash, only to be instantly vaporized, their shadow preserved by the differential heating of the masonry. It was a terrifying monument to instant death. He had to move. Survival instincts, primal and cold, began to override the shock. Water, shelter, contamination avoidance. He needed to find his emergency kit, buried deep in the backyard shed, if the shed still existed. Stepping out into the open felt like plunging into a furnace. The ground was treacherous, littered with rebar, broken glass, and shards of metal twisted into impossible sculptures. He moved slowly, deliberately, using the heavy pipe wrench as a cane to test the stability of the ground before committing his weight. Every footstep was a risk. He could feel the granular grit of the fallout settling on his clothes, his skin, his hair. The metallic taste in his mouth intensified, a bitter sign that he was already inhaling the atomic debris, the microscopic, highly radioactive particles of strontium-90 and cesium-137 clinging to the dust. He spat, trying to clear the noxious flavor, knowing it was futile. The fine powder was insidious, already coating his mucous membranes, entering his bloodstream. He had perhaps already absorbed a lethal dose, but the calculation was irrelevant now. Survival was no longer about avoiding death, but delaying it long enough to achieve some temporary, meaningful objective. The shed, miraculously, was still standing, though leaning at a precarious 45-degree angle. It had been shielded by the main house. He forced the warped door open, the interior dark and smelling strongly of gasoline and mildew. The emergency kit, a military surplus canvas bag packed years ago with non-perishable food, a Geiger counter, and water purification tablets, was exactly where he had left it, tucked under a pile of old tarps. He slung the heavy bag over his shoulder. The weight was instantly reassuring. He pulled out the Geiger counter, a battered relic from the Cold War era, and flicked the switch. The needle immediately slammed violently into the red zone, his speaker emitting a frantic, continuous torrent of clicks that merged into a single, terrifying buzz. The radiation levels were catastrophic. He was standing in a hot zone, the initial fallout field settling around him like poisoned snow. He knew the rules. Move quickly, avoid dust inhalation, seek dense shielding. The basement had saved him from the blast, but staying on the surface now was a death sentence. He needed to find a place deep underground, a place sealed against the toxic atmosphere. The city's underground subway system, perhaps, or the old municipal bunker rumored to exist beneath the library. He turned his gaze toward the ruined skyline, a vista of impossible desolation. The city center was a smoking caldera, the air above it glowing with residual heat. Nothing was salvageable. The Great War had not just ended civilization. It had rendered the entire environment actively hostile. He adjusted the wrench in his hand, the cold metal grounding him. He gripped the canvas bag tighter, finding a strange comfort in the familiar heft of the supplies. He visualized the route, staying low, utilizing the deep trenches carved by the blast, moving only during the brief lulls in the distant roaring fires. The weight of the future pressed down, heavy and suffocating, but the instinct to persist was heavier still. The immediate task was survival, a grim, brutal calculation of distance versus exposure. He had perhaps an hour before the acute radiation sickness began to truly incapacitate him. He started walking, his silhouette swallowed instantly by the toxic gloom, moving away from the ruins of his former life and toward the unknown radioactive future. The only sound accompanying him was the hysterical, ceaseless clicking of the counter, marking every second closer to his inevitable decay. The air was a chemical weapon, thick and viscous, a slurry of nitrogen oxides and volatile fission products that burned the back of the throat. Elias tasted copper and ozone, the phantom tongue of superheated, vaporized metal clinging to his palate like a corrosive film. The Geiger counter, a battered Model 593 strapped tightly to the canvas bag, was a relentless, shrieking informant, its internal speaker tearing through the unnatural silence of the ruined city. Its needle was violently vibrating against the mechanical stop-a-constant, high-pitched whine that served as the silent scream of lethal flux. He estimated the ambient dose rate exceeded 100 roentgens per hour, a figure that moved him beyond the realm of immediate injury and into the certainty of terminal exposure. He was walking through a concentrated plume, a deadly, invisible river of ionizing particles. The bombardment felt like a high-frequency pressure against his eardrums and across his exposed skin, a palpable signal of the systematic dismantling of his cellular foundation. It was the sound of his own death being meticulously engineered molecule by molecule. He moved in a desperate, strained, low crouch, his muscles already protesting the exertion. He utilized the shallow trenches carved by the initial pressure wave linear depressions in the pavement, an earth that offered only minimal, fractional shielding, but crucially kept him below the densest cloud layer that still hugged the horizon. The heavy, blackened steel pipe wrench, his only tool and weapon, felt laughably inadequate against the invisible enemy, yet its cold, familiar heft was a necessary, grounding distraction from the icy dread pooling and expanding in his stomach. The ground was no longer recognizable soil or asphalt. It was a pulverized mixture of concrete dust, aerosolized metals, and pulverized glass, forming a toxic slurry that coated everything in a uniform gray-white film. Each step was a crunching, sickening sound, disturbing the radioactive dust and sending fine, irritating particulate into the stagnant air. He focused intensely on the rigid, mechanical rhythm of his movement, counting steps and breaths in a futile attempt to impose a semblance of order on the surrounding absolute entropy. He forced the chaos outside his skull, locking his focus onto the next 10 feet of ground. The residential street was utterly unrecognizable, transformed into a landscape of impossible, abstract geometry. Houses had been sheared apart, as if by a colossal invisible razor, brickwork dissolved into fine, abrasive grit. Structural integrity was a forgotten concept. He stepped carefully over the remains of a sedan, its metal shell crumpled into a compact, unrecognizable cube. The paint had not merely burned. It had blistered, vaporized, and been scoured away in the instantaneous thermal flash, leaving dark, ghostly outlines of the passenger's shadows etched permanently onto the concrete in the remaining wall sections. These were the only monuments to the instantaneous vaporization of life. The heat, even now, hours later, had been unimaginable. The air still shimmered faintly above the warped and cracked pavement, creating heat mirages that distorted the ruins. It was a profound, terrible silence, a vacuum where the sounds of life should have been, broken only by the counter's ceaseless, frantic ticking, which seemed to accelerate as he moved closer to the epicenter. He stopped briefly, his breath ragged, pulling a sealed foil packet of potassium iodide tablets from an inner pocket. The immediate, overwhelming threat was external gamma exposure, a whole-body dose delivered by the surrounding environment. But the secondary danger of inhaled isotopes demanded a swift, chemical defense against thyroid saturation. The thyroid, a greedy sponge for iodine, had to be flooded with the stable, protective agent before the radioactive iodine-131 could settle. He chewed the bitter, chalky tablets quickly, forcing the protective iodine into his system with a swallow of dry, burning air. The taste was intensely medicinal, a sharp, chemical tang that momentarily eclipsed the pervasive copper and ozone of the environment. The act was a small, necessary gesture of control, a defiant, microscopic rebellion against the overwhelming statistical chaos. It was a purchase of minutes, perhaps, against one specific pathway of internal poisoning. His skin felt tight, stretched, and subtly flushed across his cheeks and neck, the first subtle sign of erythema, the radiation burn beginning its insidious work beneath the surface. The metallic taste in his mouth intensified, turning from a mere tongue to a heavy, sickening presence. Nausea clawed at his consciousness, a cold, insistent wave that was the unmistakable precursor to acute radiation syndrome, R. Given the dose rate screaming from the counter, he calculated he had perhaps 3 hours, maybe 4, at the absolute maximum of functional, coordinated mobility left before the gastrointestinal stage rendered him helpless, collapsing his immune system and leaving him prey to internal hemorrhage and infection. He had to be shielded deep underground, behind at least 4 feet of dense, unbroken concrete, before the catastrophic cellular damage manifested in his central nervous system and digestive tract. Every tremor in his hand, every spike of nausea, was a biological countdown, a physical manifestation of the clock running down to 0. He reached the end of the block, where the residential zone abruptly met the commercial strip, or what remained of it. Here, the destruction was more centralized, the structures heavier, and the debris piled higher. He saw the first unshielded bodies, crushed beneath fallen lintels, impaled by twisted rebar, or horribly burned into grotesque blackened statuary. Elias did not, could not, look closely. Empathy was a luxury that demanded time and emotional bandwidth, both of which he had depleted. Every second spent observing the human cost was an exponential increase in his absorbed dose, shortening his own lifespan by minutes he could not afford to lose. He forced his gaze forward, treating the dead not as former people, but as mere components of the toxic topography he needed to traverse obstacles, hazards, and markers of lethal hotspots. He focused only on the trinity of survival: distance covered, density of shielding ahead, and time remaining. He needed to cross the old municipal park, now a vast, smoking crater where ancient oaks had once stood. The park offered less structural shielding than the commercial buildings, just open air and pulverized earth. It offered a clearer, straighter line of sight toward the rumored entrance of the pre-war municipal bunker. located deep beneath the central library. The bunker, built specifically for high-yield civil defense scenarios decades ago, offered the singular highest chance of intact air filtration systems, and critically, thick, dense concrete barriers designed to withstand megaton yields. It was the only viable sanctuary in the grid. The ground beneath the park was soft, yielding beneath his boots, a treacherous, unstable mixture of topsoil, shattered granite, and fine, volatile ash. The radiation buzz intensified immediately, the Geiger counter screaming louder, the sound bouncing off the remaining skeletal structures as he stepped into the open area. He risked a moment, pulling out the small vial of water purification tablets. The only visible source of liquid was a stagnant, shallow pool of oily runoff, shimmering with an iridescent, sickening sheen. The temptation was agonizing. His throat was sandpaper. But he decided against stopping. The exposure cost required to purify and drink the contaminated water outweighed the immediate benefit of hydration. The thirst was a constant, debilitating agony, but drinking the pool water, undoubtedly laced with heavy metals and internalizing hot particles, would only accelerate the internal damage and bring on the gastrointestinal symptoms sooner. He forced himself to move past the shimmering puddle. His movement became less a walk and more a staggered, lurching run, fueled not by physical energy, but by pure adrenaline and the sheer, overwhelming terror of the counter's ceaseless, high-pitched drone. He pulled the thin cotton scarf over his mouth, a useless but necessary psychological barrier against the taste of death and the grit in the air. His lungs burned with the effort, the exertion drawing the toxic air deeper into his chest. He pushed his legs harder, urging his failing, poisoned body to maximize the distance covered for every single second of exposure. His vision began to tunnel slightly, the peripheral edges blurring with fatigue and the early effects of neurological stress. He passed the library structure. It was a skeletal ruin. The magnificent dome collapsed inward, leaving only the massive reinforced concrete foundation visible, a grim, gray fortress of engineering tenacity. He scanned the perimeter frantically for the sealed blast door, a heavy, steel-framed entryway that should have been clearly marked. He spotted it near the loading dock, partially obscured by a fallen section of the facade. It was a massive, riveted steel rectangle designed to withstand lateral forces of hundreds of tons. The surrounding concrete was thick, dense, and miraculously intact, a reassuring sign that the shockwave had not compromised the immediate entrance structure. The air around the door felt marginally, infinitesimally cleaner, offering a fleeting, desperate moment of relief that sharpened his focus. Reaching the door required navigating a precarious field of twisted rebar, sharp shards of marble facing, and broken glass that crunched ominously underfoot. He slipped once, his boot catching on a jutting piece of steel, and he caught himself violently on his left wrist, barely registering the searing pain and the immediate bloom of fresh blood through the ripped fabric of his sleeve. He dropped the canvas bag. The counter, cushioned by the soft earth, went momentarily silent. The sudden, absolute quiet was jarring, feeling momentarily deafening after hours of incessant noise. That blessed silence was immediately and violently replaced by the frantic, thundering pounding of his own heart against his ribs. He snatched the bag and the screaming counter, forcing himself back to his feet. The mechanism was a heavy, circular wheel lock, the kind designed to be operated manually against tremendous pneumatic pressure. He placed the heavy steel pipe wrench onto one of the spokes of the wheel. The metal was cold, resisting his initial weakening efforts. He gritted his teeth, his reserves of strength already draining, the absorbed radiation leaching his physical capacity. The mechanism was seized by decades of corrosion, and the massive shockwave had jammed the heavy rubber seals in their housing. The wheel refused to budge, locked solid. He leaned into the wrench, putting his entire failing body weight into the turn, bracing his feet on the rough concrete. The metal shrieked in protest a hideous grating complaint that echoed in the ruins. He turned the wheel perhaps a quarter of an inch, the movement agonizingly slow. He rested, sucking in the toxic air in short, ragged gasps, feeling the familiar, burning tightening in his chest. He slammed the wrench again, using the momentum. The wheel gave way slightly more, the rusty bolts grinding inside their housing, releasing a cascade of oxidized metal dust and particulate onto the concrete. It was a small, agonizing victory, purchased at the cost of crucial minutes of lethal exposure. He knew, with absolute certainty, that failure here meant a slow, agonizing death in the irradiated streets, his body degrading while he was still conscious. The bunker offered the only path to extended survival and a chance, however slim, to wait out the worst of the fallout. He needed to be inside before the onset of debilitating neurological symptoms, the irreversible confusion, the uncontrollable tremors, the complete inability to coordinate movement. The clock was running down, measured not in minutes, but in roentgens absorbed. The metallic taste in his mouth was now overpowering, thick and cloying like old blood. The wrench felt slick in his sweaty, numb hand, a terrifying sign that the peripheral nervous system was beginning to fail, sacrificing sensation to systemic damage. He locked his jaw until his teeth ached, preparing to spend the absolute last of his strength on the final necessary life-saving turn. He locked his jaw, preparing to spend the last of his strength. The counter, shrieking its high-pitched warning, was pressed against his chest, vibrating through his ribs. He planted his feet wider on the gritty concrete, channeling every ounce of kinetic energy into the rotation. His left wrist, throbbing and abraded by the steel, screamed as he leveraged his entire weight against the long handle of the pipe wrench. He pushed, forcing the effort past the threshold of conscious pain, the world narrowing to the critical friction point between the rusty wheel and the unyielding pressure of the sealed vault door. Ligaments in his shoulders stretched past their limit. The deep, burning ache in his core muscles signaled structural failure. The sound that followed was the violent reversal of geologic time. The massive circular wheel shrieked, a metallic scream drowning out the hysteria of the Geiger counter. He felt a sickening give, not in the mechanism, but in his own structure, a deep, tearing sensation across his lower back, followed by a wave of vertigo and the cold sweat of crashing blood pressure. The wrench slipped slightly, tearing fresh skin, but he caught it instantly, fingers locking around the cold steel. He slammed the wrench down again, using the maximum leverage and the downward force of his collapsing body weight, ignoring the blinding flashes of white-hot pain that detonated behind his eyes. He tasted bile and salt, the sharp, metallic tang of effort and internal damage. One full rotation. That was the singular, absolute metric of survival. He focused with manic intensity on the scant quarter-inch of rotational movement already gained. He pushed again, a guttural sound escaping his throat, swallowed by the grinding cacophony of metal and metal. The wheel moved another agonizing half-inch, then another. Inside the housing, the ancient, rusty bolts and secondary pins began disintegrating under the torque, showering the floor with oxidized dust. Then came a series of sharp, explosive cracks. The pneumatic seals, decades old and fused immovably to the heavy steel frame, finally began to tear free, sounding like distant rifle fire. The tremendous pressure holding the door shut was finally failing, surrendering its authority to his brute force. He continued turning the wheel until the long handle of the wrench dug painfully into the concrete wall, forcing him to shift his grip, sacrificing milliseconds. The metallic taste in his mouth intensified, becoming thick and overwhelming. He dry heaved, the convulsive effort paralyzing him, leaving him bent double, trembling uncontrollably. He recognized this debilitating nausea immediately, the unmistakable first stage of severe gastrointestinal syndrome, the systemic shutdown caused by the massive radiation dose. He knew he had to be inside the shielded space now. Delay was no longer an option, only a rapid, agonizing death. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline, he pushed the wheel the remaining distance. The massive lock mechanism gave way with a tremendous shuddering metallic clunk, a sound of finality and release. The vault door, designed to withstand a direct thermonuclear strike, was decisively unsealed. A rush of air, stale, cold, and heavy, smelling distinctly of ozone, mineral dust, and mold, hissed out of the crack, a tangible promise of sanctuary. He dropped the wrench. It hit the concrete with a dead sound, immediately drowned out by the renewed, hysterical screaming of the Geiger counter. The sudden proximity to the massive, exposed structure, saturated with radiation, was pushing the counter past its calibrated limits. A continuous, piercing whine, a physical manifestation of lethal danger. He grabbed the edge of the circular door, finding the recessed emergency handle. He put his shoulder against the cold steel and shoved. The door moved grudgingly, scraping heavily against the concrete threshold. It revealed a black, square aperture and a steep, downward-sloping ramp. He scrambled through the opening, half falling, half diving, dragging the heavy supply bag and the screaming counter behind him, tumbling into the relative safety of the breach. The immediate space was a small, cylindrical airlock chamber, dimly lit by a single flickering amber emergency light. The air was heavy, recycled, and marginally cleaner than the atmosphere outside. He didn't pause. Survival demanded the immediate sealing of the external breach before contamination flooded the inner structure. He spun around, slamming his back against the inner surface of the vault door, using the momentum of his fall to drive the massive slab shut. He located the internal lock wheel, a smaller, heavy twin of the one outside, and spun it wildly, desperately, focused only on securing the seal and engaging the locking bolts. The heavy, final thud of the primary seal engaging was the most beautiful, life-affirming sound he had ever heard, an undeniable separation from the lethal environment outside. The airlock was sealed. He collapsed instantly, his legs giving out, his body hitting the cold steel floor with a jarring impact. The counter, placed beside him, continued its incessant wail, but the reading was already dropping, the frequency of the clicks settling into a rapid, frantic rhythm, indicating the shielding was highly effective. The external threat was gone, but the internal clock was accelerating rapidly toward zero. The neurological symptoms were accelerating. His hands were shaking violently, an uncontrollable oscillation from his core. He tried to focus on the single flickering amber light, but it split into two overlapping, unstable images. His vision blurred. The overwhelming vertigo returned, sickening and disorienting. He closed his eyes, trying to force the world back into focus. He lay there fighting the rising tide of panic and the urge to vomit. He knew he had absorbed a lethal dose of radiation. Acute radiation syndrome was in full swing. The severity of his exposure was collapsing the timeline. Motor failure, gastrointestinal distress, and systemic fatigue were shoving him towards central nervous system failure. He was dying. He forced himself to sit up, leaning against the cold steel of the vault door. He needed to move deeper. The airlock was a temporary shield. He reached for the counter, its siren song settling into a tolerable ticking. The airlock had an internal door, a heavy, sliding pressure bulkhead, painted faded green. He struggled to his feet, every muscle screaming in exhausted protest. He fumbled with the control panel next to the bulkhead-worn brass buttons and a cracked viewport. His numb fingers located the activation button. He pressed it, leaning his weight into the action. A low, resonant thrum vibrated through the floor, followed instantly by the grinding, hydraulic sound of oiled gears engaging deep within the wall. The green bulkhead slid open slowly, revealing a short, dark corridor leading into the heart of the bunker. The corridor was rough, poured concrete, lined with heavy piping along the ceiling, and illuminated by intermittent fluorescent strips that flickered erratically, casting the passage in a sickly, unstable yellow light. The air quality immediately improved. The deeper sanctuary utilized an ancient, struggling air filtration system. He could hear the low drone of the ventilation fans far off. He stepped across the threshold, feeling the drop in temperature and increase in humidity. The silence here was oppressive, a deep, unnatural quiet, amplifying the rasping sound of his ragged breathing and the frantic ticking of the counter he clutched. The concrete corridor wall was marked with faded stencil lettering, Decontamination Station Level 1. He ignored the instruction. Decontamination was pointless for internal exposure. He needed two things: medical supplies and clean water. He followed the heavy piping deeper, the corridor sloping steadily downward, the concrete walls growing thicker, the intermittent light growing dimmer. The walls were weeping moisture, condensation collecting in beads, smelling faintly of mineral deposits and stagnant water. The bunker was holding structurally intact, a testament to the over-engineered paranoia of the pre-war designers. But the feeling of safety was thin. He was inside the sanctuary, but he had brought the apocalypse with him, sealed inside his own rapidly failing body. The long, agonizing battle for his life, fought against an invisible, internal enemy, had just begun. He pressed on, staggering toward the lower, more protected levels, the thick, metallic taste of his own decay a constant companion. The metallic taste of decay was constant, a pervasive, coppery film coating his tongue, now joined by the burning, corrosive acid reflux of his failing stomach. Each surge brought a fresh wave of nausea that clawed at his throat. The antiemetics he had taken hours ago were losing the desperate battle against systemic shock and the relentless churning of his irradiated core. He moved through the subterranean complex not by conscious will, but by brute inertia, a heavy, sinking mechanism. His limbs felt impossibly weighted. Every step was an agonizing, calculated decision against imminent collapse. The concrete corridor sloped downward, a gentle incline that felt like scaling a cliff face, and maintaining verticality was an unbearable tax on his shattered inner ear. He stumbled hard, his knee buckling, catching himself against the rough, damp wall. The aggregate concrete scraped a line across his cheekbone, leaving behind a stinging grit he lacked the energy to wipe away. He paused, pressing his forehead against the cool, moldering surface, seeking a moment of respite that his failing body refused to grant. The filtered air, thin and recycled, carried a sickening cocktail, the sickly sweet scent of ozone from sparking conduits, deep mineral dampness leaching from the bedrock, and the sharp, acrid signature of biological decay his own, perhaps, or something worse lurking in the depths. The ventilation system overhead wheezed and rattled with the sound of a dying lung. The massive charcoal filters were choked solid with fallout particulate and years of undisturbed dust. The machine was struggling, and so was he. The Geiger counter, clutched so tightly in his hand that the plastic casing dug into his palm, was no longer merely ticking. It was hammering, a frantic, high-pitched staccato that resonated directly in his temporal bone. It wasn't measuring the environment anymore. It was counting down his minutes of cohesive thought, a relentless metronome marking the acceleration of his internal dose rate. He dared not silence it, needing the brutal confirmation of reality. His stomach cramped violently, a searing, twisting pain that felt like a knife being slowly rotated in his gut, forcing him to double over, gasping for breath against the concrete floor. He was deep into manifest illness, the acute radiation syndrome tearing through his systems. He spat onto the floor, the metallic taste intensifying into a sickening, rusty tongue. In the thin film of mucus and bile, he saw distinct, dark spots of blood. This was the irrefutable evidence. The high-energy radiation was shredding his digestive lining from the inside, opening the floodgates for bacterial translocation and the swift onset of sepsis. He knew the clock had moved from hours to perhaps only minutes before uncontrollable fever and shock would render him incapable of movement. He pushed off the wall, summoning a final desperate reserve of adrenaline, relying entirely on muscle memory and a fierce, animalistic will to find the specific supplies that might buy him a few temporary, precious hours against the inevitable systemic shutdown. The corridor terminated abruptly at a massive fortified junction, a brutalist intersection where 4 primary tunnels converged, each entrance sealed by heavy, quarter-inch thick steel blast doors. Above, a spiderweb of faded, color-coded piping ran along the ceiling. Blue for sanitation was dead. Red for primary power was silent. He desperately needed the green designation medical storage, auxiliary equipment, or general supply caches. The junction was weakly and unevenly lit by a single, flickering emergency fixture recessed high in the ceiling, casting long, distorting shadows that danced with his unstable vision. The air pressure here felt noticeably heavier, a dull thrumming against his eardrums. He leaned heavily against a cold, riveted steel pillar at the center of the convergence, struggling not just against the physical fatigue, but against the rapidly disintegrating structure of his own memory. He had to organize the spatial map of the facility before the CNS damage erased it completely. Focusing his eyes on the stencil lettering painted above the doorways was a monumental act of will. His vision blurred and fractured into chaotic double images. The persistent nausea was compounded by the sudden, sickening realization of ataxia, the profound loss of voluntary muscle coordination, which confirmed the irreversible nature of the central nervous system assault. He forced his gaze to the only viable path, the tunnel marked in faded yellow paint, auxiliary storage, infirmary access level 2. The massive steel blast door was not fully sealed. It was jammed slightly ajar, perhaps knocked loose by seismic activity or left carelessly unsealed by a previous visitor. The gap between the door and the frame was narrow, a jagged mouth of cold steel, but it was passable. He had to turn sideways, sucking his breath in against the pain in his abdomen to squeeze through the gap. The jagged steel edge scraped brutally across his shoulder, tearing the fabric of his already tattered jacket and leaving a searing line of pain. The air beyond the door was instantly heavier, thick and stagnant, laced with a sharp, chemical scent of institutional disinfectant that fought a losing battle against the overpowering stench of mildew and biological decay. He stumbled, catching himself on a stack of ruined crates into a dark staging area. The floor was littered with debris, collapsed shelving units, and water-damaged, expired rations. The primary ceiling lights were long dead, forcing him to fish out his sweat-slicked, heavy tactical flashlight. The beam cut a shaky, erratic tunnel through the gloom. He located the infirmary door, a thin, standard-issue steel panel, thankfully unlocked, marked only by a faded, rust-colored red cross. He shoved it inward with a grunt, the hinges protesting, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the profound silence of the deep bunker. The room was small, a scene of violent, scavenged chaos. The metal wall cabinets were mostly ripped open and empty, but his beam caught the glint of a secure drug dispenser unit, bolted firmly into the concrete, its indicator lights dark and useless. This was the target. His hands, shaking uncontrollably with the advanced CNS tremors, fumbled clumsily for the brass handle of the dispenser. He ripped the cabinet door open, the hinges protesting with a loud shriek that momentarily drowned out the Geiger counter. Inside, scattered among dozens of empty vials and discarded wrappers, were the only things that mattered. 3 intact, pre-filled syringes of Rad-X and 2 sealed blister packs of potent antiemetics, prochlorperazine. This was the critical find. He tore open a pack with frantic urgency, dumping 2 pills onto his tongue and swallowing them dry, ignoring the burning protest of his throat and esophagus. He needed to stabilize the vomiting immediately. The Rad-X offered only a slim chemical chance to slow the internal absorption of the circulating radioisotopes. It was not a cure, merely a delay, but a delay was everything. His coordination was so compromised that fumbling the first syringe felt like trying to thread a needle in a hurricane. He jammed the needle into his thigh, the injection clumsy, shallow, and brutally painful, bringing no immediate sense of relief, only a fresh, hot wave of nausea. He immediately repeated the action with the second syringe, urgency overriding the physical pain and the rising fever. The Geiger counter, which he had dropped onto the examination table, pulsed violently in response to the massive internal dose, its staccato tick turning into a continuous, high-pitched whine. The machine confirmed the brutal truth. The internal dose rate was critical. The circulating isotopes were freely poisoning every cell. The dose was unambiguously lethal. He scanned the room frantically, his vision sweeping across the sterile surfaces for water. He needed massive fluid replacement immediately. He twisted the chromium faucet handle on the small sink, connected to the defunct blue pipe system. Nothing but a hiss of stale air. The system was utterly dry. He forced himself to move, kicking aside biohazard bags and discarded medical waste toward the small storage closet in the corner. Tucked against the back wall, shielded by a collapsed shelf, were 3 sealed, military-grade water pouches, their heavy plastic casing intact. He tore the first pouch open with trembling, desperate hands, the thick plastic ripping loudly in the silence. He brought the spout to his lips and drank deeply, greedily, the act of swallowing an effort of pure desperation. The water was metallic and lukewarm, but it was liquid life flooding his parched throat. He drank the entire pouch in one continuous, shuddering gulp. The sudden intake of volume triggered immediate and violent abdominal spasms. A searing, twisting protest from his damaged stomach lining, threatening renewed, catastrophic vomiting. He forced himself to hold it down, clamping his jaw shut, leaning his head against the cold metal shelf. He focused entirely on the rhythmic, distant, mechanical wheezing of the failing ventilation system overhead, the sound of the facility's last breath mirroring his own. He had secured the immediate necessities: potent antiemetics, a temporary chemical buffer, and critical fluid replacement. But the terminal reality remained utterly unchanged. He was dying quickly, the symptoms of organ failure accelerating past the point of medical intervention. The profound fatigue was the onset of systemic failure. He watched the fine, uncontrollable tremor intensify in his hands, confirming the irreversible nature of the CNS damage. He needed a place to hide now, a dark, enclosed corner where he could conserve the last vestiges of his strength and wait for the drugs to either grant him temporary reprieve or for the final, merciful collapse to arrive. He staggered back toward the door, pushing himself away from the contaminated chaos of the infirmary. It was too open, too vulnerable. He remembered the stencil clearly now: auxiliary storage. That area often held maintenance crawl spaces, utility conduits, or a sealed sublevel designated for deep isolation. He needed that isolation. The silence of the bunker was broken only by the rasping sound of his ragged, shallow breathing and the escalating, frantic hammering of the Geiger counter. Gripping the remaining supplies, the third syringe, the last blister pack, the 2 remaining pouches of water, he knew with chilling clarity that they were not tools for survival. They were instruments for managing the final, agonizing decay. The deeper, darker levels of the complex beckoned, offering merely a quieter, colder place to finally, definitively collapse. He turned and lurched toward the auxiliary storage entrance, chasing the shadow of oblivion. The corridor outside the infirmary was a study in sterile decay, long abandoned to the fine, accumulating dust that now coated every surface, undisturbed for 2 centuries. His boots scuffed softly against the polished linoleum, the sound unnaturally loud, swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence. He used the polished metal handrail as a guide, his left side scraping against the cold institutional wall. lending him the necessary support his failing musculature refused to provide. The tremor in his hands had migrated into his limbs, causing his knees to buckle slightly with every other step, transforming his walk into a desperate, lurching stagger. The hammering of the Geiger counter, strapped tightly to his wrist, was no longer a warning. It was a rhythmic, frantic heartbeat of terminal reality, its intensity spiking and dropping as he passed defunct junction boxes and thick, insulated electrical conduits running along the ceiling. He reached the auxiliary storage entrance, the designation stenciled in faded, military-grade black lettering above a heavy, reinforced steel door. It was built for containment, a solid barrier designed to withstand external pressure or internal emergency. The door was sealed by a thick, magnetic locking mechanism, its indicator light a dull, sickly orange. He pressed his face close to the cold metal panel, breathing in the stale, metallic air that leaked from the seal. The lock required a 6-digit key code, an administrative override sequence that had been drilled into him during his initial security briefing, a memory now fractured and slippery in his radiation-addled brain. His fingers, slick with cold sweat and the slight, oily residue from the water pouches, danced agonizingly over the keypad. He tried the sequence once, then twice, failing both times, the lock protesting with a sharp, electronic rejection tone that echoed painfully down the silent corridor. Frustration, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm his remaining focus. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to recall the context, the mnemonic trigger, the year of the Great Annexation, followed by the sector designation. On the third attempt, the numbers materialized clearly through the haze of systemic failure. He entered the code slowly, deliberately. A heavy, mechanical clunk resonated deep within the door's housing, followed by the loud, grinding protest of massive gears disengaging. The seal broke with a sharp, vacuum-like hiss, and the heavy steel plate retracted into the wall with a slow, grinding shriek of protesting metal, revealing a void of absolute darkness. The air that rushed out was noticeably colder, denser, carrying the distinct, sharp scent of ozone, machine oil, and deep, undisturbed stagnation. He stepped across the threshold, the door automatically cycling shut behind him with another deafening finality, plunging him into a darkness so profound it felt tactile, pressing against his eyes. He fumbled for the small, low-powered emergency torch he had secured from the infirmary supply drawer. The beam, weak and yellowed, cut a narrow path through the gloom, illuminating the immediate space. This was not a storage closet. It was a maintenance staging area, a concrete cube lined with heavy-duty shelving that held replacement filters, thick rolls of industrial cabling, and defunct ventilation units wrapped in brittle, 2-century-old plastic sheeting. In the center of the floor, secured by heavy bolts, was a large, circular hatch, a manhole cover leading down into the facility's utility sublevels. The designation stenciled beside it read, "Reactor access, coolant trunks." This was the isolation he sought, the deepest, coldest grave the facility could offer. He knelt, the effort sending a wave of searing pain through his lower back. He twisted the 2 heavy locking handles on the hatch cover. They resisted, stiff and frozen with age, requiring him to use his entire body weight, grunting through clenched teeth, his vision blurring momentarily with the exertion. With a final sickening metallic scrape, the seal yielded. He lifted the heavy cover, leaning it against the wall, revealing a narrow, vertical shaft and a steep, rusted ladder descending into the abyss. He began the descent, the metal rungs cold and sharp against his palms. Every downward step was a victory against gravity and his own failing body. The shaft was narrow, claustrophobic, and lined with thick, insulated coolant pipes that ran parallel to the ladder. As he dropped lower, the ambient temperature began to climb sharply, a humid, oppressive warmth replacing the cold stagnation of the upper levels. The air grew thick, heavy with dust and the low frequency, deep subsonic hum of dormant, massive power conduits running along the walls, indicating proximity to the main power nexus or the core containment area. The Geiger counter, which had been frantic in the corridor, now escalated into an unbroken, continuous high-pitched shriek. The radiation levels here were intense, far exceeding the safety threshold, confirming he was descending toward the very heart of the facility's lingering contamination. He embraced the sound, the continuous whine a perverse comfort. It meant the end would be swift, hastened by the environmental decay he had sought out. He reached the bottom of the ladder, dropping the last few feet onto a rough, oil-stained concrete floor. The space opened up dramatically into a massive, cavernous chamber, the main utility level. It was a cathedral of steel and concrete, crisscrossed by a bewildering, spaghetti-like network of pipework, fixed steam lines, massive coolant trunk lines wrapped in decaying asbestos insulation, and insulated electrical conduits the diameter of small trees. The only illumination came from the faint, sickly yellow glow of emergency strip lights, spaced hundreds of feet apart, casting long, fractured shadows that danced with the heat shimmer rising from the floor. The air here was suffocating, humid, and metallic, tasting sharply of copper and ozone. He moved slowly, deliberately, using the massive pipe bundles as support. He was looking for a recess, a corner shielded by concrete or lead, a place where he could simply cease to move. He found it deep within the labyrinthine structure, past the silent, hulking forms of defunct water filtration pumps and decommissioned heat exchangers. Tucked into a far corner was a recessed maintenance bay, a small alcove designed for deep repair work, shielded on three sides by thick, lead-lined blast doors that had been welded shut after the facility was put into permanent lockdown decades ago. It was a sealed, self-contained crypt, isolated from the main flow of the utility tunnels. He stumbled into the alcove and collapsed onto the cold, oily floor, the sound of his body hitting the concrete muffled by the sheer scale of the chamber. The exertion had been catastrophic. His breathing was shallow and ragged, a wet, rattling sound in his chest. The uncontrollable tremor now shook his entire body, causing his teeth to chatter violently, despite the oppressive heat of the utility level. He managed to push himself back against the thick, cold steel of the welded blast door, letting the metal absorb some of the feverish heat radiating from his skin. He dropped the remaining supplies onto the floor beside him. The two remaining water pouches, the last blister pack of chemical buffers, and the final, preloaded syringe. He stared at the syringe, its clear liquid shimmering faintly in the weak light filtering in from the main tunnel. He realized with a chilling, absolute clarity that the antiemetics were irrelevant now. The violent retching and vomiting that had plagued him for days had stopped entirely, replaced by a profound, terrifying stillness in his abdomen, the cessation of peristalsis, the definitive sign of terminal shock and widespread organ failure. The drugs were no longer for managing symptoms. They were merely instruments for controlling the final, searing agony. He tore open the last blister pack, crushing the remaining tablets against the steel door and mixing the powder with the lukewarm, metallic water from the first remaining pouch. He drank the mixture slowly, forcing the bitter, chalky liquid down, coating his throat and stomach with the chemical buffer, a final, futile gesture against the irreversible acid damage consuming his insides. The cold truth settled over him like a shroud. He had successfully navigated the final stages of his decline, finding the perfect, deep isolation. He was beyond medical intervention, beyond hope, existing now only within the narrow window granted by the chemical reprieve. He reached for the final syringe, the cold plastic hard and unforgiving in his trembling hand. He located the central venous access point on his neck, the point of entry for the final, desperate dose. He didn't inject immediately. He lay there, listening to the high, relentless shriek of the Geiger counter, the sound now fused with the deep, resonant hum of the dormant facility. He focused on the sensory decay. The edges of his vision were dissolving into a gray, shimmering static. The metallic taste of irradiated air was so potent it felt like chewing on copper filings. And the heavy, pounding rhythm of his own failing heart was the only sound louder than the Geiger counter. He knew he was waiting for the final collapse, the moment the central nervous system would simply give way. This was the end of the line, the deepest, darkest corner of the world. He pressed the tip of the needle against his skin, the cold metal a sharp contrast to his fevered flesh. He closed his eyes, drawing a final shuddering breath, preparing to push the plunger and enter the final phase of oblivion. He lay listening to the high, relentless shriek of the Geiger counter, a sound fused with the deep, resonant hum of the dormant facility, a vibration of colossal indifference. This subterranean complex, designed to safeguard the world's knowledge, now merely amplified its toxic dissolution. His vision dissolved into gray, shimmering static, a constant visual snow caused by neurological damage. The metallic taste of irradiated air, like chewing copper filings, coated his tongue and throat, a constant reminder of the poisoning that had reached its terrible crescendo today. The pounding rhythm of his failing heart was the only sound louder than the counter, an irregular drumbeat marking the final minutes of his biological coherence. He waited only for the inevitable collapse, the moment the central nervous system, overwhelmed by chemical chaos, would give way. This was the end of the line. He pressed the needle tip against his fevered, clammy flesh, fighting the violent, agonizing tremor that threatened to snap the delicate cannula. The tissue was taut and slick with perspiration. He closed his eyes, drawing a final, shallow breath, tasting the ozone and decay, preparing to push the plunger and terminate the slow-motion catastrophe of his body. The coppery tongue became the unmistakable flavor of internal hemorrhage, the systemic failure of his vascular endothelium. Crimson petechia spread like a dark rash across his chest. Viscous blood seeped sluggishly from his swollen gums. The terrifying, consuming heat radiating from his core was the terminal cytokine storm, the immune system's catastrophic, self-consuming war. He was a bag of toxic, decaying biological material, held together only by inertia and the desperate will for controlled release. The air smelled faintly of ozone and burning organic matter, the sickeningly sweet smell of his own consumption. A fever warped his sense of time, stretching seconds into minutes. Every nerve ending screamed, demanding cessation. He opened his eyes, forcing his gaze upward at the vaulted ceiling. Shadows seemed to writhe, a degradation of his optic nerve. He reached out a hand, watching the cerebellar ataxia, the jagged, uncontrollable spasms. Finding the vein was difficult, the tissue swollen and distended by edema. The syringe contained a pre-mixed cocktail, high-concentration morphine sulfate and a rapid-onset barbiturate. It was the only clean, measured dose of order left in this dying, chaotic world, a precise chemical promise of peace. The sterile stainless steel plunger felt cool and reassuring beneath his thumb. He remembered the mission, the pointless bureaucratic directive to retrieve the data core from this deep-level archive. It had been a fool's errand, a ghost command from a defunct government. He had carried the core for 3 days through the scorched landscape, its weight a physical manifestation of a dying commitment, only to drop it an hour ago, realizing its utter irrelevance. The information was history, and history ceased to matter the moment the thermal flash turned the sky white. All that mattered now was the cold, clinical steel of the plunger, the final point of control. The core lay forgotten in the dust, a useless monument to human folly. He positioned the needle, fighting the last involuntary surge of survival instinct. He had endured enough. He pressed the plunger firmly against the rough, cold metal wall. The cold liquid hit the vein, a shocking rush of icy, chemical fire. For a brief, horrible moment, the agony spiked, reaching unbearable intensity as the central nervous system registered the massive influx of pharmaceutical agents. Every pain receptor screamed in unison. Then, abruptly, silence. The pain didn't fade. It simply ceased to transmit. A heavy blanket of chemical numbness muffled the screaming nerve endings. The feverish heat of the cytokine storm remained, but the burning sensation was gone, replaced by an overwhelming, seductive warmth that spread rapidly through his limbs, dissolving muscular tension and smoothing the jagged spasms. It was the body yielding completely to the chemical command for rest, a surrender more profound than sleep. The auditory world decayed first. The high shriek of the Geiger counter suddenly slowed, its frequency dropping dramatically. The ticks became spaced out, heavy and dull, like the slow tolling of a distant bell in a fog. Tick, tock, tock. The delay stretched, warping time, making each interval feel like an eternity, the sound of his auditory cortex shutting down. The facility's deep hum deepened further, becoming less sound and more palpable pressure against his eardrums. The visual field collapsed inward, accelerating its demise. The gray static intensified, consuming the periphery until he was looking through a narrow, shimmering tunnel of light. The utility lights resolved into hazy, elongated streaks of yellow, diffusing into the encroaching darkness. His jaw slackened, his facial muscles relaxing for the first time in days. The uncontrollable tremor vanished, replaced by a heavy, beautiful stillness. He was sinking rapidly into the velvet, suffocating weight of the barbiturate's embrace. The paralysis was complete. He tried to draw a breath, but his diaphragm failed to respond to the frantic signals from the medulla. Respiratory arrest. There was no panic, only a distant, detached acknowledgement of the biological inevitability. He was floating now, the sensation of his body against the cold steel dissolving into profound weightlessness. The final, desperate fight for oxygen was muted, waged by a consciousness already halfway gone. The final sensory input was light. The shimmering tunnel narrowed, the yellow streaks condensing into a single, blinding point of white. The catastrophic failure of oxygen supply to the visual cortex, the last neurological spark before darkness. The agonizingly slow talk of the Geiger counter became unbearable. He heard the final resonant talk, carrying the crushing weight of finality through his emptying mind. Then, only the deep hum of the dormant facility remained. Even that began to fade, dropping in frequency, becoming a subsonic vibration that gently rocked the edges of his awareness. The oppressive heat receded, replaced by an infinite, cold vacuum, the absolute zero of non-existence. The profound isolation he sought was complete. The world had ended for him, not in fire or pain, but in absolute silent zero. The last flicker of neurological activity dissolved into permanent darkness, leaving behind only the deep, silent architecture of the grave.